At precisely 11:34 a.m., the world's most advanced missile defense system failed. The sharp sound of a distant explosion reverberated across the skies over Seoul, a chilling reminder that no defense is absolute. The North Korean Hwasong-15, a road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missile, had slipped through the layers of South Korea's defense network, striking an unassuming target in the heart of the city. The deflection attempts by the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense THAAD system were unsuccessful, a fatal miscalculation that left the region on edge. This was no ordinary attack. It was a message and escalation that threatened the delicate balance of power in the region. And in this moment of vulnerability, the United States' strategic response would be tested as never before. Could America's military dominance, honed over decades of warfare, shield its allies from a world on the brink? Don't just watch, engage. If clear-eyed military analysis matters to you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your voice fuels our mission to deliver truth beneath the headlines. The alarm bells rang throughout the command centers in Seoul, and within minutes the entire South Korean defense apparatus had been set into motion. The initial explosion was a wake-up call that sent waves of shock through both the South Korean and U.S. military leadership. It wasn't just about a missile strike. It was a direct challenge to their collective security and a testament to North Korea's growing technological capabilities. The THAAD system, a shining jewel in the South Korean defense network, had been deployed to intercept long-range ballistic missiles, including the Hwasong-15, a missile capable of carrying a nuclear payload. However, the missile's trajectory was designed to evade intercept. The powerful radar systems, while capable, were unable to react in time to the high-speed evasive maneuver the missile executed. THAAD's interceptors, designed to target missiles at high altitudes, failed to lock onto the incoming threat, and the missile slipped past, detonating its warhead on the outskirts of Seoul. Within moments, the U.S. forces stationed in South Korea, including Army and Navy units, began to reposition their assets. At 11:40 a.m., the first fighter jets, F-35 Lightning IIs from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, were launched into the sky. The F-35, a fifth-generation stealth fighter with unparalleled capabilities, was the U.S.'s frontline response. These planes were not just interceptors. They were part of a larger strategy to establish air dominance, ensuring that no further attacks could proceed uncontested. Meanwhile, in the sea lanes south of the peninsula, the U.S. Navy's USS Ronald Reagan, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, readied its fighter jets. These multi-role aircraft would act as a deterrent and, if necessary, engage North Korean air assets or launch retaliatory strikes. The presence of the U.S. Navy was not just a show of force, it was an integral part of the layered defense system that had been in place for years, ensuring that any attack on South Korea would face immediate consequences. By 12:10 p.m., the full weight of U.S. military might had mobilized. Ground-based missile defense systems, such as the Patriot PSK-3, began to lock onto any potential secondary targets. Patriot missiles designed for shorter-range threats were an essential part of the defense network against shorter-range tactical missiles that could potentially breach the outer layers of defense. Their quick reaction time was critical as the situation began to escalate. Despite the quick reaction of the U.S. and South Korean forces, the battle for the skies and the defense of the nation was far from over. As North Korea's missile systems continued to grow in sophistication, the United States and its allies knew that this event, though a setback, was only the beginning of a new phase in military competition in the region. The stage was set for an unprecedented geopolitical conflict, and South Korea's defense shield would be pushed to its limits. The clock was ticking. As the skies over Seoul darkened from the weight of tensions, the full force of North Korea's retaliation strategy began to unfold. By 12:45 p.m., the U.S. forces had already established a defensive perimeter, but North Korea was not content with a single missile strike. In a calculated move, Pyongyang activated its largest missile systems, launching a barrage of short to medium-range Scud and Nodong missiles aimed at both military and civilian targets in the south. It was clear this wasn't just a single offensive, it was a full-scale attempt to overwhelm the defenses. The THAAD system, still reeling from its earlier failure, had to recalibrate quickly. A missile launch from the Nodong series was detected, a powerful liquid-fueled missile capable of reaching up to 1,300 kilometers. As the radar system locked onto the target, the THAAD launchers fired. The interception was clean this time. The missile disintegrated in midair, sending a plume of smoke and debris into the sky. However, there was no time to rest. Another wave of Scud missiles was already on the move this time, designed for a more complex trajectory that tested the agility of the defensive network. Simultaneously, the United States Air Force, coordinated through a joint operations center, began a series of surgical airstrikes. At 1:00 p.m., a squadron of F-22 Raptors, designed for stealth and air superiority, entered North Korean airspace. Their mission to neutralize North Korea's air defense infrastructure, including the Soviet-era surface-to-air missile systems, SAMs, that had been upgraded with some of the latest tech from China and Russia. The F-22s, invisible to the enemy radar, performed a precision strike on radar stations and missile launchers, taking out several critical components of North Korea's anti-aircraft defenses. However, the operation wasn't without its risks. As the Raptors withdrew, North Korean MiG-29 fighters scrambled to intercept. Meanwhile, in the Sea of Japan, the USS Ronald Reagan's aircraft had been conducting operations as a mobile command post. By 1:30 p.m., the carrier launched a series of Tomahawk cruise missiles aimed at key North Korean military installations. The Tomahawk, with its precision guidance and range, was used to target missile silos and underground facilities, strategic assets that could deliver another blow to South Korea's defenses. It was a calculated move to degrade North Korea's capability to sustain missile attacks, but the real challenge was still ahead. With every missile launched, the battle for control over the skies and the seas was becoming more intense. In the midst of the chaos, the political leaders of South Korea and the United States were coordinating on the next steps. While the military apparatus was in full motion, diplomatic channels were also open, communicating with China and Russia, both of whom had a vested interest in preventing the situation from spiraling out of control. The global stakes were rising. The moment had come to prove that American military power and the combined strength of NATO could deter chaos and bring stability to a fractured region. As the situation reached its peak, the focus shifted to the ground forces. The South Korean military, bolstered by U.S. infantry and armored divisions, began preparing for a possible land conflict, reinforcing key border positions and bunkers. They were bracing for the possibility of a long-term military engagement, a conflict that could reshape the future of the Korean peninsula. By 2:00 p.m., the situation had evolved into a full-scale strategic maneuver, with both sides preparing for the long haul. The U.S. and South Korean military, now locked in a tense standoff, with North Korea, found themselves in a precarious position. While air superiority had been established by the F-22 Raptors and the F-35s, and the missile defense systems had managed to intercept many of the incoming strikes, the threat on the ground was becoming more imminent. North Korea, sensing the mounting pressure, began shifting tactics. At 2:15 p.m., the first wave of North Korean ground forces began moving south. With artillery pieces capable of firing on Seoul from a range of over 100 kilometers, the North was attempting to apply pressure from the ground. The South Korean military, reinforced by U.S. forces, began a series of countermeasures. The U.S. Army's Patriot missiles were deployed in conjunction with South Korean K-9 Thunder self-propelled howitzers, which took up strategic positions in the southern sectors. These were designed to create a defensive perimeter that could withstand the initial barrage of artillery, preventing North Korea from gaining further ground. Simultaneously, the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Division, stationed in the south, took up positions along key roads leading into the capital. They prepared for possible direct combat with North Korean infantry units. The stakes were high. Any attempt to advance on Seoul would be met with an overwhelming counterforce. But the North Korean forces were not known for backing down easily. At 2:45 p.m., the U.S. Navy, still in position off the coast of South Korea, shifted their operations. The USS Ronald Reagan launched another set of airstrikes, this time targeting the North Korean artillery units positioned in the mountains to the north. These strategic airstrikes were designed to prevent a prolonged artillery bombardment that could potentially damage critical infrastructure in Seoul. The Tomahawk missiles, fired from the carrier's deck, rained down with surgical precision, hitting military command centers, artillery batteries, and supply depots, severely hampering North Korea's ability to continue its ground assault. Back on land, South Korea's own K-2 Black Panther tanks, supported by U.S. M1 Abrams tanks, rolled into position. These formidable machines were tasked with guarding key choke points on the roads leading into Seoul. Their presence ensured that the North Korean advance would face an immediate counteroffensive, making it difficult for the enemy to gain any ground. As the tanks rumbled through the streets, the tension on the ground became palpable. Soldiers from both sides were preparing for the inevitable confrontation that could unfold within hours. Yet despite the rapid response of U.S. and South Korean forces, a dark cloud of uncertainty hung over the entire region. Could these military assets and strategies be enough to hold back North Korea's aggression? Or was the region headed towards a broader conflict that could involve more players, especially Russia and China, whose interests in the Korean peninsula were as much about influence as military might? With every passing minute, it became clear that this crisis was not just about the Korean peninsula, it was a global test of power strategy and the military prowess of the United States and its allies. The stakes had never been higher. The unpredictable nature of modern warfare had just been underscored. As the U.S. and South Korean forces continued to position their assets, the unexpected began to unfold. At exactly 3:30 p.m., a new layer of the conflict was introduced, an invisible war taking place far beyond the battlefield in cyberspace. North Korea, known for its cyber warfare capabilities, had silently activated a series of sophisticated digital weapons. For the first time, the physical battlefield would be met by an entirely new kind of assault cyber disruption. The South Korean military's communications network, which had been running at peak efficiency, suddenly began to fail. Officers at the Joint Chiefs of Staff struggled to send critical orders as their communication systems were scrambled. The U.S. military's network was not immune either. A well-coordinated cyber attack had targeted critical satellite communications, forcing both U.S. and South Korean forces to rely on emergency protocols. With no clear command and control communication, military units on the ground began to lose their synchronized operations. In a matter of minutes, the entire defense posture shifted from a well-oiled machine to a chaotic scramble for reestablishment. By 4:00 p.m., the global balance had started to shift. North Korea, not content with simply launching missiles or conventional artillery strikes, had deployed a full-scale digital offensive, using its elite cyber warfare units to launch a series of devastating hacks. South Korea's air defense systems, initially responsive to incoming missile threats, now found themselves unable to detect certain targets. The F-35s and F-22 Raptors, previously invincible in the skies, began to encounter false data being fed into their systems. They were seeing phantom targets decoys that led them on wild goose chases away from the actual threats. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy's satellite navigation systems, vital for the accurate targeting of Tomahawk cruise missiles, began to malfunction. Precision-guided weapons, once the hallmark of America's technological advantage, now faced the uncertainty of disrupted GPS coordinates. The USS Ronald Reagan, which had been a vital pillar in the defense effort, suddenly found itself in a precarious situation. Without the capability to deploy its high-tech munitions with pinpoint accuracy, the carrier's aircraft were forced to rely on secondary targeting methods that increased their risk of failure. In Washington, the Pentagon scrambled to respond. While the U.S. Cyber Command began working feverishly to counterattack, there was a deep realization that this form of warfare had become a game-changer. What had begun as a conventional military conflict was rapidly turning into a multifaceted global confrontation, where technological supremacy was just as crucial as boots on the ground or fighter jets in the air. But the cyber strike was only the first twist. By 4:30 p.m., something even more unexpected happened. As if on cue, China began to move. Though it had remained neutral in the conflict so far, Beijing's actions spoke volumes. A fleet of Chinese warships operating under the guise of international waters began to advance closer to the Korean peninsula. On the surface, it appeared to be nothing more than a standard military exercise until the first Chinese air patrols crossed into South Korea's Air Defense Identification Zone, (ADIZ). The Chinese move caught the U.S. off guard, forcing Washington to consider whether this was an opportunity to assert influence or a deliberate provocation meant to test the waters. The escalation was clear. If China was to actively intervene in the conflict, the balance of power would dramatically shift. While it remained unclear whether this was a coordinated response to the situation or a strategic maneuver designed to showcase Beijing's growing military assertiveness, the possibility of a China-South Korea-U.S. confrontation loomed large. With the cyber attack still wreaking havoc and China's moves in the region complicating the situation, the geopolitical landscape had changed in an instant. This was no longer just a battle for the Korean peninsula. It was shaping up to be a global conflict involving not just North Korea and the US, but major powers with competing interests. The stage was set for a broader military escalation, and no one knew what the next hour would bring. As the twist continued to unfold, the question remained, could the United States and its allies restore the balance, or had the global order entered a new phase of unpredictable and volatile power plays? As the crisis deepened, it became evident that this was not simply a regional conflict over the Korean Peninsula. It was a reflection of a much broader shift in global military dynamics. The combination of North Korea's missile strikes, cyber warfare tactics, and the unexpected Chinese involvement had escalated the situation into an all-out test of military power influence and geopolitical stability. The strategic landscape had changed dramatically, and with every passing hour, the stakes climbed higher. From a military standpoint, the events highlighted the growing importance of integrated multi-domain warfare. The initial reliance on traditional missile defense systems like THAAD and Patriot PAC-3 had shown their limits when facing unconventional tactics, such as North Korea's cyber assault. While the missile defense systems had worked to intercept many of the conventional threats, the failure of digital defenses proved that modern militaries could no longer afford to focus on just one domain. Air, land, sea, and space all must be synchronized to respond to the evolving nature of warfare. In this case, it was clear that a failure in cyber defense had resulted in a direct challenge to the technological superiority of the United States and its allies. The U.S. response to the cyber attack was swift, but it revealed a significant gap in the ability to fight an all-encompassing digital war. U.S. Cyber Command moved quickly to neutralize the threat, but the effects of the disruption had already taken their toll. Key satellite systems had been knocked offline, fighter jets were misdirected, and ground command centers were operating with outdated data. While the Pentagon quickly rallied, it was clear that the U.S. military had not been fully prepared for a cyber warfare scenario of this magnitude, especially one launched by a nation-state like North Korea. However, as much as the U.S. struggled to regain its technological foothold, its conventional military assets, specifically its air and naval superiority, remained potent. The U.S. Air Force and Navy had effectively neutralized many of North Korea's air defenses and missile launchers in the early stages of the conflict. U.S. aircraft such as the F-22 Raptors and the F-35 Lightning IIs continued to perform their roles with deadly precision, establishing air dominance that allowed U.S. forces to neutralize North Korean air assets. Despite the cyber setbacks, the physical force projection remained a decisive advantage. Meanwhile, the emergence of China as a potential actor in the crisis significantly shifted the geopolitical calculus. China's strategic interests in the region, spanning from securing its territorial claims in the South China Sea to maintaining stability on the Korean Peninsula, complicated the U.S. response. While Beijing did not initially take direct action, the movement of Chinese warships into the vicinity of the conflict was a clear signal of their willingness to exert influence in the region. For Washington, this was a reminder that any conflict in East Asia is never isolated. It involves multiple global powers with competing interests. Should China choose to directly intervene, it would add a formidable dimension to the battle, forcing the U.S. and its allies to recalibrate their strategy. The broader consequences of the conflict were profound. On the military front, the cost would be staggering. Billions of dollars in defense spending would be required not only for the immediate conflict, but also for the technological upgrades necessary to counter cyber threats in future engagements. The United States would need to bolster its cyber defenses, ensuring that its advanced military systems were protected against future digital disruptions. Additionally, a sustained presence in the region, both on the ground and in the air, would require strategic shifts in force deployment and logistics. On the geopolitical front, the Korean Peninsula remained the most vulnerable point. Despite the U.S. military's overwhelming firepower, the political and economic consequences of an extended conflict would be far-reaching. China's involvement, should it escalate, could polarize the region into opposing blocs. A U.S.-China confrontation over the Korean Peninsula would ignite an arms race and shift alliances across Asia, potentially drawing in other regional players such as Japan and India into the conflict. In the aftermath, the United States and its allies would face the immense task of rebuilding stability in the region. While U.S. military power had proved effective in the short term, the true challenge would be securing long-term peace and ensuring that a similar crisis did not erupt again. Deterrence, both military and diplomatic, would become even more crucial in the post-conflict phase. The international community would be left to navigate the delicate balance between military readiness and the pursuit of lasting peace, knowing full well that the slightest misstep could push the world closer to another confrontation. This was not just a test of military power, it was a test of global resilience, alliances, and the very fabric of international order. The United States, having proven its military superiority in the field, would need to reaffirm its role as the world's stabilizing force committed to peace through strength. The consequences of this conflict would reverberate through the geopolitical landscape for years to come, a somber reminder of the fragile nature of peace in an increasingly unpredictable world. As the dust began to settle over the Korean peninsula, it became clear that the price of peace had never been higher. The conflict, though brief, had cost the global economy billions, and the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. The cyber warfare, which had shaken the very foundation of the U.S. military's technological supremacy, highlighted the need for a new kind of defense strategy, one that integrates cyberspace and conventional forces into an unbreakable shield. The military engagements, while decisive, were not without their consequences. The fragile balance of power in East Asia had been disturbed, and the involvement of China added an unpredictable layer to an already volatile situation. The geopolitical landscape of the region had shifted, and the possibility of future confrontations, whether military or diplomatic, loomed large. For South Korea, the cost was not just measured in destroyed infrastructure or lost lives. It was also in the loss of trust, the fear that war could be imminent at any moment. For the United States, the conflict reinforced its role as the world's leading military superpower, but also highlighted the need for greater preparation in non-traditional warfare domains. As the global community watched, the importance of alliances, especially NATO and other partners in the Pacific, became unmistakably clear. The U.S. military, though victorious in the immediate battle, faced the long-term challenge of reinforcing its strategic presence and ensuring that such a conflict never escalated again. The cost of peace was staggering, but as history has shown, strength deters chaos. The United States, standing alongside its allies, demonstrated that military might, when coupled with diplomacy, remains the bedrock of global stability. Subscribe and stay informed. The world is changing, and we must understand the forces shaping our future. History is being written, and we must pay attention.